Back when I was in college, I had a buddy, Steve. And Steve would come over pretty regularly, and one thing we would do is we would turn on my old PlayStation 1 and play some Madden. And the only thing that Steve was worse at than Madden was losing graciously. And I remember there was one day we were playing, and I was up by like 35 at halftime, and he was angry, and he was grumpy, and he was bitter, and he was getting ready to just give up and leave or punch a hole in my TV, one or the other. And I was fed up with him, and so I just said, here, and I handed him my controller, and I took his. So what that meant was instantly, all of a sudden, he went from being down 35 to being up 35, and it was crazy. His whole attitude changed. He was all of a sudden happy and giddy, and he was like trash-talking me. And what it resonated for me was that winning changes our perspective, right? When we're winning, that changes our perspective on a lot of things. And I say that as well, mourning the fact that my team just lost 2 in a row. So it's funny when you watch the NFL season play out and you watch the pundits on Mondays and Tuesdays, depending on how the game went, totally changes the perspective on your team. So when your team is losing, they're trash, right? But it's amazing how football is like a game of inches. So picture this, your team is down by 4, the final seconds of the game, your quarterback throws a pass into the end zone, but just at the very last second, it just deflects off the very tip of the defender's fingers, and the ball floats off incomplete, and your team loses. The narrative on the Tuesday is that your coach doesn't know how to win. Doesn't know how to draft players. Your quarterback is inaccurate. Receivers don't know how to get separation. Your team just doesn't know how to win. That's the narrative. But if that same ball in that same scenario travels just 1 inch higher over the fingers of that defender into the hands of the receiver for a touchdown and a win, then the whole narrative changes on Tuesday, where the coach is a winner, right? The quarterback is precise. The receiver is clutch. The team just knows how to win. That 1 inch can change the whole narrative of the perception of the team. Winning and losing changes our perception of how we view ourselves and our lives. And so you think about your life right now. What is an area in your life? Maybe it's family or finances or work. What's an area that you feel like you're winning? Maybe you just got back from Greece and everything is a win. What is an area in your life that you feel like, yeah, I'm winning right now? And think about how confident you feel in that area. Now think about an area in your life where maybe you feel like you're losing. Maybe it's finances, maybe it's work, maybe it's family or relationship. Perhaps you might even look at your marriage, some of the relationships, friendships, the drama. What's an area in your life where you feel like you're losing? And how do you feel about yourself in those areas? We're working through the book of Philippians. And as we saw last week, Paul is writing the letter of Philippians from prison. Paul has been falsely accused. He's been beaten. In fact, at one point in Paul's life, before this time, Paul is in a city, and they're so angry with Paul, they throw stones at him. They stone him. They think he's dead. They throw rocks. He's got this pile of rocks all over him. He's unconscious on the ground, and they just leave him there. Miraculously, somehow Paul gets up, rather battered and bruised, and dusts himself off and walks out of town. He's probably hunched over from beatings and lashings. He's been shipwrecked, which was just this awful nightmare of a scenario where he washes on shore just to find himself miraculously saved, and warm himself by the fire to have a venomous snake jump out and latch onto him, right? Over and over. Now he spends 2 years in prison. There's a lot of stuff from the outside in Paul's life where you're like, this guy is losing. Right? Paul feels called to plant churches, to preach the gospel, and he's stuck in custody in prison. From the outside, it looks like Paul is losing at life. Not only that, he's probably going blind. He's in pain. He's lonely, and he's stuck. And he could be at any moment either he could have an assassin break through his doors from Jerusalem and kill him, or he could end up in trial before Caesar, and Caesar goes, "You're not worth my trouble," and have him executed. In a lot of ways, Paul looks like he's losing. But when we look at the letter of Philippians, it's not someone who's defeated. There's joy. All the way through the letter, the theme is joy. And so how does Paul have joy even when it looks like he's losing at everything? So we pick it up. Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 12. Remember, he's writing this letter to a church in Philippi, this city, this Roman colony, while he's in prison, probably in Rome. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Talks about his ongoing struggle, right? The people in Philippi, this church that he started, they're worried about Paul. They're stressed about him. They're terrified about what's going to happen. And Paul says, don't worry about me. This is all, eventually, this is for good. Good things are happening. So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. There's a few times in his letters where Paul actually tells us that he's chained to these Roman guards and he's leading these guards to faith. He says, God has got a purpose even in the midst of my imprisonment. Even in the midst of my struggle, God is doing something good. I'm leading these guards, this imperial guard, I'm leading them to faith. And his attitude in chains is actually strengthening the resolve of the church. If Paul can have joy even in his circumstance, then maybe that gives a different perspective on our lives as well. Verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. The Roman church in particular, Paul is saying, is being strengthened by Paul's imprisonment, seeing his attitude, meeting with him, seeing that even though life for him sucks right now, he's finding joy, and so therefore they're emboldened that, hey, maybe Jesus is real. Right? Suffering is a universal language. We all understand suffering and our natural response to it. And so when something unnatural, supernatural happens in our suffering, when God shows up, that speaks, that shouts loudly that God is real and doing something in the midst of our suffering. It's what's happening in Paul's life. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. So there's this scenario, apparently the Philippian church has heard of it, that while Paul's in prison, there's already kind of this church in Rome, that there's some pastors and some leaders in Rome in the church, and then Paul rolls in, even though he's in prison, and these people feel insecure about Paul, like Paul's a big deal, and so they're envious of Paul. And so what it's leading them to do is actually preach harder, to work harder, almost out of spite. They're like, while Paul's in prison, I'm going to grow my ministry. I'm going to grow my church, almost out of spite, because Paul's in town, but locked up. And so the Philippian church hears of this, and they're worried about how Paul is going to take this. So people are almost spitefully starting churches. And Paul says, the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambitions, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only in that every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. In that I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. Paul says, I don't care why they're doing it. I don't care if they're just trying to steal my people, steal from my church so they can build their own church. I don't care. As long as they're preaching Jesus, that's all that matters to me. It's kind of like the second string running back, right? When the second string running back, the first stringer goes down, right? It's happening in Carolina right now. The first string running back goes down. The second stringer all of a sudden has got extra motivation to impress the coach. And so the first string running back sitting on the bench like, I don't care. The guy's helping us win. He's working harder. He's running harder. He didn't run this hard before. Doesn't matter. We're winning. That's all that matters to me. I don't care about my roster spot. That's kind of what Paul is saying. For I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will return out for my deliverance. Paul understands that one way or another, he's going to be set free. His hope is secure. He's either going to be free because he's going to be set free from prison and return to his ministry, or this ends in his death and he's going to be set free because of the work of Jesus. He says, I have confidence. I have hope either way. It doesn't matter what happens to me. It doesn't matter what Caesar has to say about me. I know that my deliverance is secure. I know where my hope lies, and it's unshakable. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. He's preparing to stand trial, and this eager expectation. And the Greek, it's this interesting word that connotes intense, almost painful longing. The author Josephus uses this exact word when he's talking about as an army, you're waiting for this volley of arrows, and you see them. You see them coming at you, and you have no idea where they're going to land, and you've got shields. And it's this eager expectation, is that feeling of anticipation, anxiety, as you don't know what fate awaits you. And so Paul says with eager expectation, he understands that Christ is going to be honored no matter what. That whatever Caesar says, whatever the outcome of the trial, no matter what happens with the assassins that are trying to come after him, he's confident that Jesus is sovereign, that Jesus is in control of his life, and no matter what happens to him here and now, the victory is secure. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. What he's saying is, hey, if I get vindicated, if I get set free and I live, that's great. I'm going to continue on my ministry. For me, life is all about Jesus. It's about building the kingdom. And so if I live, it's all about Christ. And if I die, even better. Because then I get to see him face to face. And so you see Paul's confidence, even in the midst of the uncertainty of his life, saying, it doesn't matter what happens to me in this life, because if I live, it's about Jesus, and if I die, it's also about Jesus. And he knows that if he dies and sees Jesus face to face, he gets to experience Revelation 21, which says that someday all pain, all suffering, all sickness, all rejection gets washed away. We see Jesus face to face in perfection. Verse 22. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which shall I choose, I cannot tell. And it's kind of hyperbole. He's kind of waxing poetic a little bit. He says, I don't know which to pray for. I don't know if I should be praying that I get set free and I go back to work, or if Caesar just says, you know what, I've had enough with you, and kills me, and then I get to rest. He's like, I don't know which I should pray for. And verse 23, I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. He says, listen, I know that you need me. I know that I'm doing good work and there's fruit happening, and so I'm praying that I will get set free, not for my sake, because I'm afraid of dying, but because I want to help you. I want to love you. I want to serve you. And sort of Paul's praying. You see him wrestling with this. As the Philippian church is just really anxious. They're worried about Paul and his mental state, locked up. Paul says, I'm good. It doesn't matter what happens to me. I'm good either way. I'd like to be set free because of you, not for me. And it kind of some way sets up what he's going to say in the next chapter, which is to put the needs of others ahead of yourself. Paul's kind of living that out here. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. Paul believes that God's not finished with him yet, and that the churches still need him. And sure enough, we see later in the story that he does get released and gets set free. And so he's confident. He knows that he hasn't done anything wrong, that it's false imprisonment, and that he'll be set free. So that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. So he's praying that someday he gets to show up in Philippi again, and they'll all worship and thank Jesus for the work in Paul's life and for that deliverance. He's praying that he would be set free, not so that he would be relieved of the pressure, but so that they could worship in what God has been doing. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come to you and see you, or am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. It says, conduct yourself. That's like a political term. It means to govern your lives according to the gospel. The Philippians is a Roman colony filled with lots of Roman soldiers who have Roman citizenship. He says, your citizenship is not as a Roman, it's as a kingdom citizen of heaven. And so govern your lives accordingly. He says, my prayer for you is that you'd learn to live this thing out properly, that you would live it out well in maturity. And so he's praying for them from prison, that they would live a life worthy of this good news of Jesus. And not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. He says, don't worry about people who are opposing you. Don't worry about those who are getting in your way or hate what's going on. Jesus is sovereign over them too. For it has been granted to you for the sake of Christ that you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Again, suffering is that universal language that when the gospel goes forward, it doesn't just go forward in rainbows and butterflies with smooth sailing. The gospel goes forward where there's difficulty, where there's suffering, where there's pain, because then God shows up real, right? When we can navigate lives on our own, then it's our own strength and God gets no glory. But when we are overwhelmed, when we can't get out of a situation, then we desperately cry out to God, and God shows up and people see that. This has been our experience in this last year, is that God put us in a situation where we couldn't get out of on our own, and we desperately cried out to him, and he showed up, and we go, wow, look at what God did this year. Somebody was talking about church planting this week. I said, church planting is kind of like intentional desperation. You put yourself in a place where God has to show up or everything falls flat, and then he does, and you go, wow, look at what God did. Church planting is intentional desperation, and he continues to show up. This week, I sort of just said, hey, we're hoping to get this new building, and we have needs. And they said, what are they? And so within an hour, I had 2 keyboards, 2 soundboards, a whole sound system, a new TV, 100 chairs, just all of it, just in an hour was all given to us. So intentional desperation. Hey, we can't do this on our own. And God says, okay, just ask me, and here you go. Engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now here that I still have. It's conflict. It's a fight. It's a struggle. There's a spiritual battle for people's souls going on. It's difficult, and it's a struggle. But what we see here, I think, in Paul's attitude and Paul's joy, is that it's a fight that we win. That victory is secured. And so how does Paul, in the face of all of this opposition, in the face of these people who are scorning him, in the face of imprisonment, possible death, in his own suffering, in his own affliction, his own blindness, how does he have joy? How does he have hope? How does he pray for the Philippians and say, hey, I'm good no matter what? How does he do that? I believe it's because he is fully confident and assured that Jesus is victorious, that Jesus has secured the victory, that it's won, it's finished. And we continue to fight this battle, and we play in this game, but we know the outcome, the victory is secured. And so it doesn't matter for Paul what it looks like in the heat of the battle. He knows, I know that we win. I know that it's victory. It doesn't matter if in the third quarter everything looks like it's falling apart. And so we see, number one, that Paul is victorious over his imprisonment. Or Jesus is victorious, over Paul's imprisonment. That Paul being locked up doesn't thwart God's plan, that God is using it. And in fact, we see that God is using it because he's leading guards to faith. It's strengthening the churches around him. And not only that, you think about, hey, Paul wanted to travel to these churches and speak to them face to face, as we all do. But he couldn't. So what did Paul have to do? He had to write letters. The thing with a letter is you can preserve it. The book of Philippians we wouldn't have. This divinely written letter, Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, these letters of the Bible that were written from Paul's imprisonment, we wouldn't have them if it wasn't for his imprisonment. He was forced to stop traveling and to write these divinely inspired letters that we have today that have been impacting people around the world for 2,000 years. That God used the imprisonment and the suffering of Paul for us so that we could sit here and have this truth on this Sunday morning. Paul had no idea that God was going to do that. But he had confidence that God was going to do something with this suffering. He was confident that Jesus was victorious even in Paul's suffering, even in the obstacles, right? You can imagine sitting in prison and being like, God, you told me to travel and to preach and plant churches. So why am I here? Why am I chained up? There's got to be this frustration, but God is doing something beyond what Paul can see. Not just for Paul, not just for the Philippian church, but for us. Jesus is victorious even in the obstacles in our lives. Number two, Jesus is also victorious over his opponents. There are people who hate Paul. There are people trying to oppose what he's doing. Even though their hearts and their motivations aren't right, Paul says, listen, Jesus is victorious in that too. That even in our selfish motives, and if we're honest, I would say there's probably nothing that we do in our lives that doesn't have some kind of selfish motivation. As righteous as we want to think we are, at our core, there's something selfish. But Jesus is victorious even in that. He uses even selfish and sinful motivations of other people for good. He used the Jewish authorities that tried to crush the early church. The early church got together in Acts 2 as this beautiful picture. They were all together. They were sharing everything. They were eating all their meals together. All their families were playing together. It was this beautiful picture in Acts 2. But what happened was it was getting too insular. They weren't outreaching, they were just loving each other. And so God uses the Jewish authorities to bring persecution, so the church has to flee. And as they flee, they bring the gospels around the world. God used even the motivation, the sinful, selfish motivation of the Jewish and Roman authorities for the good of the gospel. That Jesus is victorious even in that. The Romans tried to stamp out faith, and all it did was firm up the resolve for hundreds of years. To be a Christian meant that you faced possible persecution and death. Often. It was an underground church. But again, suffering is a universal language. And so the persecution of the Romans actually led people to see, hey, this Christianity thing is real. Because they're literally getting put on stakes and poles and burned alive. And they're not denying their faith. Like, there's something real here. Which is why Christianity took off. Why the gospel took off. Because the reality of suffering brought about by the Romans. Even Paul's jealous rivals that were attempting to leverage Paul's struggles and build their own churches, Paul says, no, God's sovereign in that too. God's victorious in that too. And finally, we see that Jesus is victorious even over life and death. Paul wasn't worried how his story would end. He knew that what Jesus had done on the cross. That on the cross, Jesus defeated sin. That the weight of our mistakes, the weight of our failures, our rebellion, we can't do it on our own. The stains of our past, the mistakes, the brokenness, the selfishness, the anger, the bitterness, the jealousy, the rage, all of those things, we can't earn our way back up to God. That is a losing battle for us. So Jesus on the cross took that battle for us and won it in our place. And so when we trust in the work of Jesus, He is victorious over your mistakes. Doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter what you're doing right now. Give it to Him. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to make amends for it. You don't have to prove that you're a good person. You don't have to work harder. You don't have to clear yourself of your past and all those things, those people you hurt. Jesus took it on the cross and claimed victory in our place. Our sin is washed clear because of the victory of Jesus on the cross. But not only that, the victory of Jesus in the resurrection as He defeated death itself. He is the firstborn of the resurrection, meaning that we are with Jesus, then we are also victorious over death. Listen, I don't understand that. But all I know is I try and understand even how life came to be in this universe we live in. It's a miracle out of this big bang and all the physics behind it. In the same way that God used this miracle to bring us life once, He will remake the world, this time without sin and sickness and death. And for those who are with Him now in this, He will be victorious over death. At a funeral this week, I was reminded of that. Listen, when it comes to death, we all lose. Yeah, Paul wasn't sure whether or not he was going to be executed in the next day, or as it was a couple of years later by the Romans, or if he would die someday of organ failure in his sleep in his 90s. Either way, it was the same ending. His hope was not that I'm going to extend my life a few more years. His hope was that, no, Jesus defeated death. And so with that victory over his situation, victory over his opponents, and victory over death, Paul could have joy and hope in the midst of it because he knew that Jesus won. Didn't matter how the game looked in the moment, Jesus was going to win. And so for us, Jesus is victorious, or can be victorious, over whatever situation you're in. Whatever disappointment you are currently experiencing, God can use it. If we trust Him, if we press into Him, God can bring a victory out of what looks like absolute, horrible, miserable failure. We see Paul say this to the Romans. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to His purposes. This is the great truth, that even the failures in our life, if we trust those to God, whether He's doing something in us, through us, around us, things we don't see, if we trust Him even in the midst of our brokenness, even in the midst of our failures, we trust that He will bring good. Because He's victorious over our circumstances, our situations, and our failures. So even in the areas where it feels like you're losing, you can trust that Jesus will bring about a victory if you surrender it to Him. If you say, okay, rather than trying to numb it, rather than trying to run from it or ignore it or fix it myself, if I go, God, what are you trying to do in me, through me, and around me in this? Even though it looks like failure, then Jesus can bring about a victory in your life. The second thing is over your opponents, the selfish people around you, people who want to crush you, push you down. Maybe this happens at work. People who want to push you down so they can elevate themselves. People who selfishly want to take instead of give from you. The people who are your opponents. You don't have to conquer them. We can trust justice to God. Vengeance is his. Justice is his. You don't need to conquer over them. You can allow them to feel like they win. It's fine. Jesus is victorious over your opponents. We can just love them and trust that Jesus is going to work it out. And he will use even their selfish motivations, even their attempts to push you down. He will use those for good if you let him. It might not look like it from moment to moment, but we trust him in the big picture. And finally, over our death, over our life, over our sin, Jesus is victorious. We're never going to be a good enough person. That's not a thing. The Bible says that we are too wicked, that our sin is too heinous, that when we stand before a holy God, all of us stand condemned. The image that came to me, again, leveraging the sports metaphor, you're playing against a 6'6" Sac State scholarship basketball player, and you got to win one-on-one, you're never going to do it. At least maybe I'm just speaking for myself. It's never going to happen. I cannot conquer my sin. I cannot win that battle on my own. That is a hopeless loss. Jesus in this illustration is like 1994 Michael Jordan. And you sit on the bench and you let Michael Jordan hop in there, and he's going to take that Sac State player to school. Jesus enters into the fight for us in faith when we trust him, and he conquers sin in our place so that we can sit on the bench and just watch him work. And then we see the resurrection of Jesus, the firstborn of the dead. We know that our death, which is inevitable, is not the end for us. That there's victory even in our death. Even if it seems like an untimely death, an unexpected death, even if it doesn't come on our timeline or our way, we can trust that Jesus is victorious even that. And so, but Paul says that's not where it ends. He says that we're on the winning team. That in the end, that's what Revelation says. If you ever wonder what Revelation's all about, Revelation just means in the end, Jesus wins. That there's a battle going on, and in the end, Jesus wins, even if it looks like you're losing currently. And that can change our perspective on everything if we know that even when it looks like we're losing, actually we're winning. And so, Paul says, though, as response to this, therefore, let us live lives worthy of the gospel. It says, hey, listen, you're on the winning team, so stop acting like a loser. Stop acting like defeated and like you've got to scramble and try and just sort of get whatever thing you can to make it look presentable at the end of the game. He said, no, let your lives be worthy of this good news that Jesus wins. Let him transform you. Let him change you. Let him use the difficult circumstances in your life to bring about transformation in you. Live a life worthy of the gospel. Let him point out the sin in your life and let him go to work on it. The second thing he says here in Philippians 1 is a life worthy of that also means that we need to have unity of spirit and mind, as Paul says. Well, listen, we have an enemy. We are in a fight, a struggle, as Paul says. We have an enemy who hates what God is trying to do in the world of bringing hope, of bringing victory, of bringing restoration. We have an enemy who hates it. And for 2,000 years, the enemy's number one strategy has been division, disunity. That we squabble and pick at each other about little stupid things. We say something that offends someone because we're all sinners. We're all being transformed. Nobody in this room is perfect. I'm at the front of that line. But God is doing a work in my life, and so there are times when I will disappoint you. If you don't believe that, talk to my wife. There are times when I will offend you. Hopefully not intentionally. Especially when politics comes up, apparently. The reason why we called ourselves Grace Collective Church is because it's an amazing unity in this room, diversity in this room, where we have people who have backgrounds as Nazarenes and Pentecostals and Baptists and Reformed and Catholics. 50 years ago, you would never be in the same room together. We were so tribalized. There's beauty in this diversity because we don't have to be uniform. But we need to be careful that we stay unified and that we don't become divisive. That we don't pick at each other over little things, that we let little things slide and show each other grace. And what unites us, what brings us together is grace. The victory of Jesus in our place, that's where we find our unity. Not uniformity, our unity. And so as we grow as a church, I know that the enemy wants to use division amongst us, disunity amongst us to break us apart and fracture us. Paul says, let's not let that happen. Let's have unity around the central things and be very gracious and forgiving, knowing that we're going to annoy each other. And that's okay. And the final thing Paul says is that we don't just sit on our hands as a result of this victory, that we enter into the game. We don't just sit in the stands watching other people play. Like, hey, this is cool. It's going to turn into a victory. No, God is calling us onto the field to take a part in this mission. That we are called to be ambassadors, to be vice regents in this mission, this kingdom role. And so we're supposed to enter into the game and enter into a world that is broken and hurting and feels like it's hopeless. Right? If you don't know Jesus, if you don't believe that Jesus is resurrected from the dead, then death is a loss. No matter how much you want to ignore it or numb it, we have people who are desperately just doing whatever they can not to think about the end. We have the gospel of hope and life, that there is a victory. That what happens in this life, there's so much more. And that message is given to us, that hope is given to us to go and share, to be light in the darkness, to bring hope to the hopeless, to set free those who are captive by that worldview. And that just doesn't happen on a Sunday. That happens in your places of work, in your schools, in your neighborhoods, with your kids' friends, parents. As we go on mission, just sharing, hey, there's victory. Even when life looks like it's a chaotic mess and we're losing at every turn, just be thankful you don't cheer for the Jets. There's victory, even when it looks like there's defeat in our lives. As Paul does here from prison, there's hope no matter what our circumstances because of the victory of Jesus. Let's pray.